In the forest. Horror story. As a child, I was very close to my maternal family. My grandparents and uncles always organized family reunions and events, which were always suitable for everyone. Without wanting to brag, I think my family was one of those families that could well be on the cover of a magazine. Regarding my dad's family, it was another story. They did not get along badly, but I only remember seeing my paternal uncles and aunts on the street, and from time to time, my dad would tell me that that person was my uncle, or that those children who were walking in the distance were my cousins. However, despite these situations, I did not know them at all. As a child, I thought they hated each other, and that is why we did not see them. However, now that I'm an adult, I can understand that they do not hate each other. It is just that they showed their love in a different way. Not to mention that their family had disintegrated many years ago. My grandmother, whom I didn't even know by sight, was a kind of anti-rules hippie who could never adapt to society or the role it set for her. So when her third son, my father, turned 8 before her husband came home from work, she gathered them all together, told them she had to leave, that she knew they would be fine, and that they would always strive to find happiness, even if others didn't see it as the right thing to do. My father says that although they never saw her again, she always sent money to help her father with expenses, and also she always sent them letters with beautiful pictures of the places she traveled to, so none of her children really felt abandoned by her, although it is obvious that to a greater or lesser extent, it did end up affecting them. Most of them followed her advice too well and were quite individualistic. That was the main reason why they did not get together. But all the siblings knew that they could ask each other for help in case they needed it, and in my point of view, that is the most important behavior in a family. After all this, I guess it's weird to say that my grandmother sent a letter to my dad for me to go visit her for a week. At first, Mom refused. She said they couldn't leave me alone with a woman who had never taken the time to get to know me. But my dad responded by saying that if I didn't go then, how did he plan on ever meeting me? I have always believed that the only reason my dad wanted me to go was because deep down, he longed for his mother to invite him to spend time with her. I honestly didn't know what to think about it. I was very little, and the idea of meeting an unknown relative in our family tree seemed exciting to a certain extent, like an adventure from my fantasy books. However, seeing that Mom didn't like the idea, I started to think that if they didn't let me go, it wouldn't be the end of the world. I remember my dad asked one of his brothers about the letter his mother had sent, and he told him that he wanted to meet his grandchildren, that he had sent his children about 2 months before, and everything seemed to be in order. So my mother ended up agreeing. I was quite surprised by the life my grandmother led. She was a lovely woman, but her house was far away from everything and surrounded by a huge and scary forest. She never went to the supermarket, and as far as I knew, she never left the forest. She grew her own food, raised her own cattle for meat. She didn't even have light in her house. She used candles that she made herself. Although I was still a child without a very deep knowledge of the world, I knew that visiting Grandma was like going back several years in time. However, as a good 8-year-old girl, I loved the idea of spending a few days in the countryside and exploring the secrets of the forest. The first morning there, I talked to my mother for a couple of minutes. The signal was not very good, so it was very distorted and the connection was lost very often. So I just told her that I was fine, and that Grandma's house was a little strange, but it was nice. I remember very well that when I hung up, my grandmother saw me with the phone in my hand and told me that it killed the neurons in my brain every time I stuck it to my ear. The truth is, I did not know how to answer her, so I just put it in my pocket. The rest of the day she spent talking to me and teaching me how to milk and many things to create a practically self-sustainable house. She had some strong ideas for a young girl like me at that time to understand. However, now, as an adult, I share too many of her ideas. On my second day there, I talked to my mom again, and then my grandmother told me that if I wanted, I could go explore the forest by myself. She also told me that there was a kind of path where there didn't seem to be any grass and that I shouldn't go too far away from it, so I could go back. I said yes, and I went. I was very excited because I had never done anything like that before. As soon as I entered the forest, I felt the excitement of being in a new and unknown place. The tall trees and the crunchy branches under my feet made me feel like I was in another world. But that feeling was short-lived, because after a while, I began to feel a little uncomfortable. It was like when you feel that someone is watching you. I constantly turned to see who it was, but no matter how hard I tried, I could not see anything that did not belong to the forest. I decided to keep walking. I figured it was probably because it was a new place, and maybe it was just my brain being on alert. When suddenly, I heard a rustling sound coming out of the trees. I turned around, but there was no one around me. I shook my head and kept going, but the feeling didn't go away. I think I walked for another minute, or maybe two, when I heard the rustling again. However, this time it seemed to be coming from everywhere. I decided that the beauty of the view wasn't worth what I was feeling, so I turned around, ready to go back to my grandmother's house. And then I saw her, a strange creature. It was standing only about 2 meters away from me. Its body was a bit strange. I don't know. Maybe I let myself be carried away by the memories of a scared 8-year-old girl. But whenever I remember it, I can't ignore that it seemed to be made of old wood, covered with moss and dry leaves, as if it were clothes, although to tell the truth, it looked more like a cloak or some kind of very rustic tunic. It wore a mask, carved from a log, with an eerie smile. I had never seen anything like it. At first, I thought it might be another child, but something inside me could not be sure exactly. I greeted him, but he just bowed his head as if it was the first time I saw a human being, or as if he could not understand my language. I guess it was my childish mentality, because the more I saw him, I asked him where he lived, but now he tilted his head the other way. I put my hands into the buttons of my sweatshirt just to feel the wax paper that wrapped the candies my grandmother had prepared. Just for me, they were made with some fruits. The creature came a couple of steps closer, even with its mask on. It was easy to see that it was sniffing. I smiled at it and asked if it wanted one. I unwrapped the wax paper and extended my hand for it to take one. However, the creature snatched the candy out of my hand and pushed me hard before climbing a tree at superhuman speed. My hand was full of thorns, so, crying, I ran back to my grandmother's house. She cured me, but I didn't tell her anything, because I remembered a time when I heard noises under my bed, and my parents just told me it was my imagination, and to stop saying such things. I was sure I had heard noise, as well as what I had seen in the forest, but I was also sure they wouldn't believe me. At night, while I was curled up in my bed, I heard a soft knocking on the window. I turned around, but I saw nothing there, so I thought that maybe it had been the wind that had pushed a branch of the tree that was outside my room, and that was what had caused the sound. However, I heard it again. This time a little louder than the previous time. I turned quickly and saw that thing outside my window. In its right hand, it was holding what seemed to be a bag in the dark. At first, I wasn't so sure whether to open the window or not. However, that creature pointed to the bag and I heard it drop it on the floor, and then it ran away so fast that if I wasn't looking at it, almost without blinking, I wouldn't have seen it. After a few seconds, I looked over and saw a pile of nuts lying around the bag, along with a piece of tree bark with scratches forming the words, "Shall we play?" I lifted the bag and saw that it had only nuts in it and was made of twigs twisted together. I assumed it was a peace offering or something like that. So, the next morning after helping my grandmother with her housework, I asked her permission to return to the forest. As I said before, I think I will always blame my childish innocence for exposing myself to so much danger. But I remember that as I went a few meters into the forest again, I heard the rustling again. So I turned around, this time knowing exactly what I was going to run into. However, I saw no one. I thought it might have been a bird, and I was anxious to see him again until I heard a second chirp. This time I realized that it was coming from above. So I turned around and there he was, sitting on the branch of a tree. I barely had time to see him. Because he immediately dropped on his back, and in some way that I can't explain because of how fast it was, he landed on his feet. That surprised me a lot. He was like a cat. Besides, the tree was very high. He tilted his head from one side to the other while he was staring at me. I said a hello, and then I asked him what it was, and I don't know how to explain this, but he imitated me. He answered exactly what I had said, using my voice and everything. At first it seemed he had a hard time, because he said the words between cut off or just ate some letters, but after more or less about 5 tries, he could imitate me so perfectly that I got chills on my back. So I didn't answer him anything. I just kept looking at him, and he at me, although almost immediately he asked me, using my voice again, "Do you bring more candy?" In the forest. Horror story. I answered him no, and he remained silent, staring at me with that mask that had that perpetual, badly carved smile. I could feel how he had been angry with me for not bringing more candy to our meeting. That made me feel uncomfortable and with some danger, so I told him, smiling and trying to sound as kind as possible, that I should go back to my grandmother, because I was very afraid of making him more angry. So I took a couple of steps with the intention of returning. However, that thing told me, still using my voice, that it thought I wanted to play with it. And being such a little girl at that time, I said yes, just because I didn't know how to say no to it. I asked him what he wanted to play, and without thinking too much, he answered that he wanted us to play hide and seek, that he would count to 50, and I would have to hide. I agreed, not because I thought it was fun, but because I thought that maybe that way I could try to sneak back to my grandmother's house, because every part of my survival instinct told me that I had to leave. I remember walking in the direction of my grandmother's house at a hurried pace while he counted, and at the same time, I was also mentally counting to know at what point I should start trying to hide myself until I got to my grandmother's. And when I got to 50, I started walking more cautiously, hiding behind trees or some rocks big enough for me to be covered by them. Now that I knew he was looking for me, I was much more alert and scared. I was behind a thick tree trunk, and I remember how I decided to peek out to see if he wasn't near me. When out of nowhere he fell behind me, still using my voice. He held me by the shoulder very tightly and started laughing, saying that he had found me. His hands really felt very strange. It was as if very hard branches were buried in my skin. As I got out of his fingers and told him I was sorry, but I had to go back home. He seemed annoyed by that, but I kept insisting that I had to leave and that I couldn't stay any longer, or my grandmother would worry. So he told me that if I won a race, I could leave. I honestly didn't plan to follow his game. I thought that if I said yes, I could run in the direction of my grandmother's house, and that way I could get out of the forest. I remember well that I told him it was oak, and before he could say anything else, I started to run as fast as I could. I could hear how that thing was after me. It laughed and told me that it was going to catch up with me. In the distance, I could see my grandmother's house, and for a moment I thought I could make it. However, when I was only a few meters away from getting out of the forest, that thing fell in front of me from the top of one of the trees, and it told me that it looked like I was trying to run away from her. It also told me that I couldn't leave there. My leg hurt because when I fell, I had buried some thorns, and I knew that even if I tried to run, I could not do it at the same speed as before. Not to mention that this thing seemed to be playing with me, because the way it moved, it was more than evident that it was much stronger and faster than me. I told him again that my grandmother was waiting for me at home, and he started to laugh. Only this time he didn't use my same kind of voice for that. Now the voice seemed deeper and more somber. It was very similar to that of an adult who has smoked 10 packs a day during his whole life. I would even dare to say that it sounded somewhat robotic. I remember that thing took a step towards me, while it did not stop laughing, and at that moment, I heard my grandmother's voice calling me. That thing looked at me, and with that same deep and raspy voice, told me, "Your grandmother is the witch of the forest." And after that, it started running into the forest. At that moment, my grandmother came to where I was. She helped me up and took me to the house. I dared to tell her what had happened to me, and she was very scared. She showed me a drawing she herself had made where that thing appeared. She told me that she really had no idea what that thing was, because she had only seen it roaming around a couple of times. But it had always given her the creeps, because once she had seen it skin a rabbit alive for fun. But she had considered that it was not so much a menace, because every time that thing saw her, it moved away at great speed, and she had never tried to interact in any way with it. But after what I told her, she told me that maybe that thing had been responsible for the disappearance of some children from the nearest town, and that she could not believe that just because she wanted to know her grandchildren a little more, she had exposed us to so much danger. She also told me that in this world, there are things and creatures that go far beyond the imagination of any person, and that we humans, many times we simply refuse to believe it, but that they are perfectly visible to anyone who is willing to see them. I told her what that thing told me about her, but my grandmother told me that she did not know what she was talking about. And after that, she told me that I could not stay the days I had left, because she did not know what that thing could do to me, or if it could try to get into the house. She promised to visit me later in the city, but once I said goodbye to her and went back to my house, I never saw her again or heard from her. The last I heard was that Grandma didn't want any of the missing grandchildren to visit her anymore, so no one else saw her again. Today that I am an adult, I am not sure if she is dead or still alive, because not even my dad knows. I always think about that thing and what it could have done to me if my grandmother had not come to save me that day. But also, sometimes I wonder if my grandmother was really a witch, or why that thing was afraid of her. I guess I will never know. Thank you for joining us for this spine-tingling story. We hope you found it both thrilling and thought-provoking. If you enjoyed this video, please consider participating in our channel by subscribing, liking, and sharing it with your friends. Your support goes a long way in helping us create more engaging content for you. Goodbye, and may you always tread carefully in the world of the unknown.